The Boeing 787 Dreamliner soared gracefully above the clouds, gliding effortlessly at 38,000 feet. Inside the aircraft, passengers from all walks of life sat in their seats, engaged in conversations, reading books, or simply gazing out at the vast expanse of the sky. Among them was a young man named Daniel Carter, an avowed atheist, confident in his beliefs, or rather his lack of them. He never saw the need for God, never thought about faith, and lived his life relying solely on logic and reason. The plane was filled with passengers of diverse backgrounds, including a significant number of Muslims. A group of them sat near Daniel, dressed in modest clothing, some whispering prayers under their breath. They were calm, peaceful, and content. Daniel had never paid much attention to religious people before, but now he found himself seated right next to one, a man named Yusuf, who had a long beard and warm, kind eyes. A routine flight turns to chaos. The flight was smooth for the first few hours, but as they approached the Atlantic Ocean, turbulence began to shake the aircraft. At first it was mild, just a few jolts. But then, without warning, the plane suddenly lurched violently. Overhead compartments swung open, and some passengers let out startled cries. The captain's voice came over the speakers, his tone tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The shaking intensified. The plane dipped suddenly, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. People clutched their armrests. Some closed their eyes, whispering prayers. Yusuf and the other Muslims began reciting verses from the Quran, their voices steady and calm. Daniel, however, was not calm. His hands were shaking, his breathing rapid. His heart pounded as the plane trembled violently, as if it were being gripped by an invisible force. Then came the unthinkable. A loud explosion rocked the aircraft. The lights flickered, and the oxygen masks dropped from above. The cabin was filled with screams. Outside, one of the engines was on fire, flames licking at the wing. "We have lost an engine," the captain announced, his voice filled with urgency. "Brace for impact!" Daniel's mind went blank. His life flashed before his eyes, his childhood, his college days, his career, his friends. He had never once thought about death in a serious way. He had always believed that when life ended, that was it, nothingness. But now, as he stared at the terrifying scene before him, the thought of nothingness terrified him. The plane jolted again, and Daniel's body was thrown against his seat. He gripped the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breaths were shallow, his thoughts racing. "This can't be happening. This can't be how I die." His eyes darted around the cabin. People were crying, some screaming, others clinging to their loved ones. But then his gaze landed on Yusuf and the other Muslims. They were calm, not fearless, but calm. They were reciting prayers, murmuring the name of God. Daniel couldn't understand it. How can they be so at peace? How can they accept this? His panic deepened. His mind searched for a solution, a way out, but there was none. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had no control. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. A deep, primal fear gripped his heart. "What do I do?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was asking. Then, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Yusuf. "Calm yourself, my friend," Yusuf said, his voice steady. "God is with us." Daniel's eyes widened. God? He wanted to argue, to say there was no God, but the words wouldn't come. Fear had shattered his confidence, his logic. "I don't believe in God," Daniel said, his voice shaking. Yusuf smiled gently. "You say that now, but your heart seeks him." The plane lurched again, and Daniel let out a choked sob. "If there is a God," Daniel whispered desperately, "why is this happening?" "God tests us," Yusuf replied. And sometimes he brings us to the edge, so we may truly see. Daniel looked into Yusuf's eyes. There was no fear there, only conviction, the kind of conviction that Daniel had never had. "Pray with me," Yusuf said. Daniel hesitated. He had never prayed before, had never even considered it. But now, as death loomed closer, he had nowhere else to turn. "How?" he asked weakly. Yusuf took his hand. "Just say, 'Oh God, if you are there, help me.'" Daniel swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life denying God's existence. But now, in the face of death, denial felt empty. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Oh God, if you are there, help me." A moment of clarity. As soon as he uttered the words, something shifted within him. A strange warmth spread through his chest, a sense of peace he had never known before. The plane was still shaking, still on the verge of disaster, but for the first time, Daniel felt something other than fear. "Good," Yusuf said. "Now, put your trust in him." Daniel held on to Yusuf's words as if they were a lifeline. He continued whispering prayers, his fear gradually fading. And then something incredible happened. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker. "We have regained control. The aircraft is stabilizing." The violent shaking subsided. The flames on the engine were being extinguished. The plane, which had been plummeting just moments ago, was now climbing steadily back to safety. A collective gasp filled the cabin. People began sobbing, not in fear, but in relief. Daniel couldn't believe it. Just minutes ago, they had been on the brink of death. And now, they were safe. His hands were still trembling, but this time it wasn't just from fear. It was from something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. He turned to Yusuf. Did God just save us?" Yusuf smiled. "What do you think?" Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he whispered, I believe." The rest of the flight continued in silence, with Daniel deep in thought. He had spent his entire life rejecting the idea of God, but in the moment of his greatest fear, when logic had failed him, faith had found him. When the plane finally landed safely, passengers erupted into applause. People embraced, thanking God for their survival. Daniel stepped onto solid ground, feeling like a different man. The world looked new, brighter. He turned to Yusuf and took a deep breath. "Teach me," he said. "Teach me about God." Yusuf placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling. "It would be my honor." And so, on a flight that nearly ended in disaster, Daniel Carter found something he never expected: faith. A journey that began with fear ended in peace. And from that day forward, Daniel was no longer an atheist. He was a believer. Epilogue. That night, as he lay in bed, Daniel did something he had never done before. He prayed. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive.